Okay, so we'll be doing some table stuff later, so we might need to move around if people stay uniformly distributed across the environment here, but clustering would be good. So I'm Keith Gillis, and I'll be doing some introductions here. I'm Dean of the College of Natural Resources at Berkeley, and when I'm doing productive work in my life as opposed to being a dean, I'm a professor of forest economics and deeply involved these days in public policy as chair of the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, which has given me a whole new appreciation for what it means to interact with local government and state government entities. So just before we get started, I'm going to have our facilitator give you the lay of the land for the session.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I've got my own here. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for hanging in there with us this afternoon. We look forward to an interesting discussion again this afternoon, and our topic here is a little bit of a mixed bag of things, but extreme weather, agriculture, health, and business. So our panelists will help frame some of the issues. We'll explore these issues in a little detail, and then our main task of today is to talk at our tables, as you did before, and try to prioritize some solutions in relation to those topics that we could work together on as in the context of CRI. So that's our task. You can do introductions at the tables later if you haven't already. And Todd Hara will be keeping some graphic notes that we will use in the presentation to the large group, as you know. So you know the drill. And we will try to complete our panel presentations in about 25 minutes so we can maximize the time that you have at the tables, which is so valuable. So with that, let's have our first introduction. I think
our first on deck here is Bob Dickinson. And
I think we were going to start with Noah, actually.
Oh, we're going to start with Noah.
Yeah,
okay.
if you don't mind.
So let's randomize my sheet then.
Sure.
Okay.
There you go.
So Noah Diffenbaugh is Associate Professor in the School of Earth Sciences and Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at that institution down the road that we are cooperating with and not competing with in this endeavor. His research interests are on the dynamics and impacts of climate variability and change and the role of humans as a coupled component of the climate system. Works on fine-scale processes in shaping climate change impacts, studies of extreme weather, water resources, agriculture, human health, and poverty vulnerability. He's a lead author for Working Group 2 of the IPCC and a member of the National Academy of Sciences Ad Hoc Committee on Effective Provisions in the Internal Revenue Code on Greenhouse Gas Emissions. So, Noah.
I should have sent a shorter bio. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm really glad to be here and glad to be collaborating and not competing. Many of my most outstanding colleagues are here at Berkeley, so I'm certain that we would lose if we were competing. So I'm glad we're cooperating. So I guess I want to just with my few minutes. There are I guess four bullet points that I want to touch on in terms of extreme events and how extreme events shape climate risk. And we know from our day-to-day experience that extremes are where we most often and most acutely feel stresses from the climate system. And this is, you can view this through the lens of billion-dollar weather disasters. You can view this through the lens of ecosystem vulnerability, in some cases all the way to the extent of species extinction. So there are many ways we can view this lens. Agricultural impacts. It's often the extremes where we really feel the climate system. And we know that the likelihood of many kinds of extremes has increased over the recent decades, and there are also a few ways to view these increases. We can look at the trends we can look at time series of extremes and ask whether or not there have been trends, and that's been documented particularly for extreme temperature, but also for heavy rainfall and extreme sea level events, particularly with a U.S. focus for those. We can also think about risk, and the risk of the climate-related risk is some kind of function of the likelihood of the hazard. So that might be heat wave or flood or drought. So there's the hazard term. There's the exposure term, which is the assets that are exposed, and that assets is maybe a harsh terminology, but it could be people, it could be infrastructure, could be ecosystems. So essentially, what's in the path of the hazard. So if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Likewise, if a tornado moves across the Great Plains and there's nothing in its path, is there an impact? So you can have the hazard, but the exposure is an important term in the risk as well. And then there's the vulnerability term. So how vulnerable are those assets? And the three of those together make the risk. And so we know that the risk of climate stresses has already increased from the global warming that has already occurred, simply because for those hazards that we've seen the likelihood increase. And a couple of examples for really extreme events. The research community is getting to the point, when I was in graduate school back in the early 2000s, if there was ever an extreme event like, say, like the drought that we're experiencing in California now, or the tornado that hit Moore, Oklahoma last spring, or Superstorm Sandy, whenever the public-facing statement from scientists that study the climate system a decade or decade and a half ago, whenever an event like that happened, the public-facing explanation from scientists was, we can't attribute any individual event to global warming. That's weather, and we're talking about climate, et cetera, et cetera. And over the last decade or so, there's really been a substantial community that's built up that's really working hard to try to understand how the likelihood of these extreme events has changed, whether it's changed in response to global warming. And so we're really at a place now where we're looking at this California drought right now, literally trying to understand whether the likelihood of these kinds of conditions have changed. And so just for the 2013 extremes, or people are still looking at those. If we go back to 2012, for the flooding that occurred in Superstorm Sandy, the latest research suggests that the likelihood of that level of flooding has increased by about a factor of 2 because of the sea level rise that's already occurred. The extremely warm spring conditions in the United States, so March of 2012 was extremely warm, and the research suggests that that's been about a 10-fold increase in the likelihood of those conditions because of global warming. And then work that my group did focused on the extreme heat in the United States. In the summer of 2012, we've calculated about a 4-fold increase in the likelihood of those conditions because of the global warming that's already occurred. So we've really moved to the point where we're able to really ask about the hazard term in terms of that risk analysis. And I would argue that we need equal, thank you, we need equal emphasis on the exposure and vulnerability terms, because those together create the risk both now in the current climate and also going forward. No, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Noah, very much.
Yeah, so now we'll move to Bob Dickinson, president of Argo Analytics, a firm based on developing tools to enable public and private sector organizations to enhance their climate resilience. Bob has a long history in the semiconductor and computer industries. His last position there is CEO of California Micro Devices. Before that with Cirrus Logic, Western Digital, Zilog, and Burroughs. Was the CEO of 2 startup companies. Served as director of Transmeta, a public semiconductor company. With a long Berkeley lineage, Bob's father was the director of the Forest Products Laboratory here at Berkeley and a very famous wood technologist. And I got to admit, I loved it when more than a year ago, Bob came into my office and said, you know, what's Berkeley doing on this? And we need to do something better. And I said, yeah, that's a lot bigger than my college. That's 6 deans you got to get organized. And Bob has relentlessly pursued getting those 6 deans together. So, Bob?
Well, thank you very much, Keith, for a very, very nice introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. My basic premise today is that a vital and thriving Bay Area business community is critical to our success in meeting the challenges of climate change as a region. Following 3 points relate to how we can ensure that. First is that businesses can't just worry about the impacts that happen here. Climatic impacts elsewhere matter. And the October 2011 flooding in Thailand is a vivid example of that. If you look at the slide, the upper left is a picture of one of 2 Western Digital disk drive plants that was disabled for months, many months, as a result of that flooding. In the upper right is a summary of the market disruption that resulted from that, and the fact that Western Digital spent nearly $1 billion as a result of it. In the lower left is a sample of headlines at that time that demonstrate how the economic impact rippled up, down, and sideways through the PC ecosystem, including major Valley companies such as Hewlett-Packard, Intel, and Marvell. And I said sideways, so that means competitors. In the lower right is a chart of relative stock prices between Western Digital and its primary competitor, Seagate. And you'll see a separation there that happens very shortly after October, which reflected Seagate's ability to deliver disk drives when Western Digital couldn't. So huge shifts in market valuation of those 2 companies as a result. I might note, by the way, that somebody this morning, maybe it was David Ackerley, showed a picture of Hondas sitting inundated in a lot in Thailand. So the PC industry was not the only one that was affected, but it was affected in a big way, and the effects were felt very much here in the Bay Area. Second, if we can go to the second slide. Resilient networks reduce business risks and create competitive advantage. So businesses rely on a variety of networks. Some are local, some are geographically dispersed, with supply chains being a familiar example. And networks amplify risk. I've shown here a calculation that for disruptive events with different return times, how the likelihood of at least one occurring in a network increases, now this is occurring over a 5-year period, increases with the number of locations. So if you have 100-year disruptive events that are threatening each location, if you have 5 locations, the probability of at least one disruptive event in 5 years is about 20%. Now suppose the return time drops to 25 years, which could be the result of climate change and other factors such as development, increasing the exposure of assets to those disruptive events. Well, now it's 65%. So better than 50-50 that if you've got 5 nodes in your network that are exposed, that you're going to have something bad happen in 5 years. That's pretty significant. Now, by the way, many supply chains have a lot more locations than that, because it's not just factories, it's also components that feed those factories. So the numbers go up even more rapidly than that. On the good side, however, networks can be reconfigured to reduce the risks. And there are 2 ways that you go about it. One is reducing the exposure and the vulnerability at the individual nodes. For example, moving your factory up out of the floodplain would be an example. And the other is to build redundancy into the network. Doing that not only reduces risks, but it creates competitive advantage, with the case of Seagate and Western Digital being a pretty good example of how that works in practice. So the clear message for business here is that they need to evaluate how risky their networks are to climate change and other things. And by the way, they typically do this in terms of other risks, but they're not generally looking at climate change yet, which is going to become increasingly important, and reconfigure them to make them more resilient. And then the last slide, please. So my third point is that people and companies are mobile. Regions aren't. I mean, the Bay Area is where the Bay Area is. And other things being equal, people are going to choose to live in places where the impacts of climate change will be the least severe. Think, for example, of Phoenix or Dallas compared to the Bay Area 20 or 30 years from now. Companies will follow the talent. The talent will move, companies will follow the talent. So it's very easy to envision a resilience race developing in the future, where regions are competing in terms of what they've done to reduce the impact of climate change on the quality of life in their region. Just as today we see competition for companies based on financial incentives.
Okay. Thank you.
So 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you.
The Bay Area starts with 2 huge advantages. It's currently the epicenter of high tech, and it's happily in a favorable position relative to climate change. But if we aren't proactive in building resilience, we could end up in a vicious circle rather than a virtuous one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Very timely remarks, given the political discussion in Sacramento this week about our vulnerability to the capital gains tax and how the California economy has a very interesting financial structure that makes risks like this particularly serious for us. So now we're going to have Niall Mallory, California Program Director for Communities for a Better Environment. His work is on local land use, environmental, health, and climate programs, policies to support local resilience, their ability to recover quickly from extreme circumstances in Oakland, Richmond, the rest of the Bay Area. He's interested in social entrepreneurship and innovative projects to address community problems. He is taught and lectured at the New College of California and is a former high school teacher in San Francisco. And anyone familiar with the environmental justice literature knows that Richmond, right in our backyard, is ground central for this. So, Niall.
Great, thank you. So my name is Niall Mallory, not Mallory, but Mallory. You're fine, you're fine. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think, just for CBE, Communities for a Better Environment, we're a statewide environmental health and justice organization, and we work to build community power, to get neighbors and others involved in what they can see benefit their lives. And so a lot of our work historically has been looking at some of the major polluters in our community and trying to figure out ways to get them to scale and give community benefits that no longer pollute their communities. So for our work, we see a lot of the trend is, our fossil fuel reliance is causing a lot of crises, not only in local crises, like in Richmond, for example, having Chevron and working with them and trying to figure out ways to resolve several different local pollution issues, but also it links to the climate issues as well, which I'm gonna talk about. But also the issues of we have a lot of work that we're doing around policy and advocacy. We're also facing a lot of political, it's a challenge, as you all know, in terms of trying to find a way to hold businesses and others accountable, not only for the historical environmental pollution issues, but also around the growing trends around climate. So that's a very interesting tension for a community-based group, and also as a neighbor. You think about any neighbor or person that's not a part of an institution, how do they engage and be a part of this? So I think a lot of our work is really at this stage of looking at climate change, is looking at partnerships. Partnerships with the community, partnerships with regulatory agencies, partnerships with other stakeholders to really work collectively on strategy that's really going to make an impact. And we've done that in several different ways. One example more recently, for the Bay Area, there's a lot of climate risk and everything like that. We're building up to that, a lot of research and data. But I think one of the most examples where people are at, looking at what happened in Richmond with the Chevron explosion. So this was an emergency issue, and you just saw what systems were in place or what was not in place for that emergency. So a lot of people have been doing some investigation, community organizations, what do we need to have in place? And what came out of that formation is, working with UC Berkeley, we're working with the Labor Occupational Health Program, we're working with the laborers, the unions, working with other community groups to really think about, in relation to this particular crisis, how do we examine it? And so our work around climate, we really are trying to figure out what are the best practices from really responding to this crisis and what we actually can do from the community standpoint of what they see. Because people don't see the necessary climate risk that we're talking about. When we talk about the drought, now everybody knows what a drought is. When we see what happened in Atlanta, I'm not sure if everybody was following the Atlanta situation. That was just a little bit of a problem. But looking at, from our community standpoint, from Hurricane Katrina to the situation in Atlanta, what we found that was consistent is that top-down approaches to engage in neighbors necessarily doesn't build their resiliency to take action for themselves. Because these communities, as we know, all of us are part of communities, have adverse challenges, these vulnerabilities, not only vulnerability around health, but also just income, the ability to respond. If you don't have enough resources as is, you can't necessarily respond, react, and have the necessary networks to really make a change. So we see several examples in our work around vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are exacerbated with climate change. And so we're trying to really address that right now from the local level and looking at adaptation as another growing trend to really push for solutions that's really going to make a difference. So we want to see the co-benefits out of this adaptation process, looking at job security, looking at equity, equity as being central to this. We live in a very inequitable system, society, where community and neighbors and other people can advocate till they're blue in the face, but we know kind of business as usual continue to happen. An example of this issue is regards to us working with the Air District, for example, around cumulative health impacts. So as we know, cumulative health impacts, we already know, identify their key. Probably there's several areas in the Bay Area that are part of what their care program. These are community, basically risk communities that are actually adversely have shown that they have higher sensitivities, they have poor land use, they get most of the pollution, et cetera. And in a recent conversation, which actually was troubling from a community stakeholder, you're talking to the chief of the Air District, and you talk about cumulative health impacts, and he said the reason why we can't address a regulation or a policy to look at reducing pollution is because of industry. He told the whole group, this is with city council people and others, that we can't push for the regulations that we want because of industry. So the question I have in this day and age, who's running the show here? Is it business, or is it regulators? Is it community involvement? These questions is what we're trying to pull together to basically bring in resources and expertise to really address that challenge, because it creates a greater opportunity. Because a lot of the analysis that we've been doing so far around climate and other research is sometimes done in a vacuum, it's done in data. One thing that we want to do more is more community engagement. We have a history of doing community-based research and analysis, really taking the ground truth from what other people think about adaptation-related issues are, what are the climate risks that they foresee, and use it as an educational tool to really address what we see. And it's been working pretty well in some of the work that we've been doing around climate adaptation planning, but also looking at climate action planning in various cities. So that's an opportunity that we identified that we need to meet people where they're at. And a lot of people in our community are looking at the polluters, the sources of climate impacts, and really want to address them. I think one of the challenges in the Bay Area right now, just looking at some of the challenges, is that we're looking at climate risk and we want to address them, but the challenge is that the fossil fuel industry is digging their heels or whatever into maintaining business as usual. And as we're looking at climate issues, we have bigger projects coming in the Bay Area. There's 4 new refinery projects coming in the Bay Area that actually has bringing in tar sands. A lot of people know about the tar sands fight. Some of us may organize around that. But those issues are interconnected as we look at adaptation, because what's happening is that we're adapting to something, but we're not fixing the root cause of the problem. So that's a challenge, and we need to address the root cause as we're looking at adapting. But a lot of us are not as vocal as we can be, and we need to work together to kind of figure out how do we actually address that. Because it's more than just speaking to the choir. It's more about how do we look at tangible projects, from clean energy to urban ag to whatever, to really looking at mitigation that's really going to bring the co-benefits to our communities.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Niall. Which, ending on, you got to look at projects, is a great lead into the last speaker on our panel. So Linda Rudolph is co-director of Center for Climate Change and Public Health with the Public Health Institute, and where she's the principal investigator on a project to advance integration of health in all policies and local jurisdictions around California. She works across a broad spectrum of public health activities and agents to incorporate health considerations into climate change actions, and in particular how they might promote healthy communities and health equity. Last year she was recognized by the White House as a champion of change, working on the front lines to protect public health in a changing climate. So Linda.
Thanks. I have 2 kids that are associated with Keith's college, so it's a pleasure to have him as my introducer. For a lot of people here and around the country, climate change remains sort of a distant threat, an environmental issue that doesn't impact people and that doesn't impact them. And in fact, we know that climate change really is the greatest health challenge of the 21st century. So we're already starting to see the impacts of climate change on health here, and we know that those health impacts will continue to worsen as the climate changes more. Climate change has both direct impacts on health and well-being, for example, heat illness or injuries or displacement from flooding, and also many indirect impacts. So, for example, climate change causes changes in the distribution of vectors that carry diseases like dengue fever and West Nile virus, which of course will impact human populations. More importantly, climate change really affects the very systems on which human life depends. Climate change impacts our air, our water, our food, our shelter, and our security. So it acts as a threat multiplier for all of our existing major health challenges. For example, increasing temperatures will increase ozone production. We already have very significant problems with the adverse health impacts of air pollution in many parts of California. Declining crop yields in California's agriculture are likely to increase food prices, especially for our healthy specialty crops, fruits and vegetables that we in public health are trying to get people to eat more of. And we know that as food prices increase, people that already face food insecurity are likely to turn to cheaper, less healthy foods to maintain their calorie input. Next slide. Climate change disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations and disadvantaged communities, the very young, those with chronic illness, the very old, people in low-income communities who don't have access to resources that are needed to cope with climate change, either acutely, for example, don't have access to transportation to evacuate in the case of Hurricane Katrina, or don't have other places to go when the lights are out for extended periods of time after Superstorm Sandy, or that don't have the economic wherewithal to deal with rising food prices or rising energy prices. And also disproportionately impacts those in communities that are already suffering from high levels of air pollution or who lack green space and tree canopy and are thus more vulnerable to the impacts of the urban heat island. So essentially the people and communities least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, both here and around the world, are suffering and will suffer the most from the impacts of climate change. Next slide. Many climate action strategies, both on the mitigation and adaptation side, improve health and address climate change simultaneously. So we can see many co-benefits. For example, if we reduce vehicle miles traveled and increase active transportation, we get a big boost in physical activity. And we know from studies done here in the Bay Area that that can yield incredibly significant public health advances. For example, we can get about a 14% decrease in heart attacks, diabetes, other very significant health outcomes if we shift the mode share to active transportation to about 3 times what it is now. Similarly, if we do energy efficiency and weatherization correctly, we can address poor housing conditions and also address fuel poverty. If we want to avert catastrophic health impacts on our children and grandchildren, we need much faster and more aggressive action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we do that right, we can simultaneously address health inequities and chronic illness and promote more resilient and sustainable communities. I think that to do that, one of the big challenges is really helping the public and policymakers understand that climate change is really about the health and well-being of our loved ones and the health of our communities. And very few people, I think, fully understand the scope of the challenge to our health that climate change brings. So in the short term, I think we need to build resources and capacity in government, in academia, and in our communities to address the climate crisis. And like right now, we lack the information that we need in terms of fully understanding the range and magnitude of health impacts of climate change. We don't really understand enough about what it will take to build resilience in the face of those health challenges in our most vulnerable communities. And we lack the kind of social sciences research that we need to frame social marketing campaigns that can really mobilize communities for climate action. In the longer term, I think everyone in this room recognizes that our actions are going to have to include addressing very, very fundamental systems change in our energy system, our transportation system, our agriculture system. And that's not only going to require strong leadership and political will, but it's going to require very robust community engagement. And I think one challenge for CRI is how to simultaneously build and maintain scientific integrity and credibility, and at the same time to lend your expert voices to the cause of building a social movement for climate action.
Great. So thanks to the panelists. And, you know, we're going to turn over to some organizational stuff here, but it is very interesting to me as someone in the university whose job it is to try and not do the science myself these days, but mobilize other people to do the science is, you know, input from the outside and how we are more effective in doing work to impact this situation, especially in this extreme events area. You know, we've had Dara O'Rourke work in Richmond in the past on community monitoring programs. We've had Rachel Morella-Frosch work on differential impacts of different parts of the population on heat. We've had our economists working on the risks to the business system, but somehow it's not getting the work done. So feedback to us to get the work done, looking forward to hearing it today. And then I'll try and apply the pressure from the inside to get my people to do that.
Good. Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much. All right. Well, that's what CRI is all about, that kind of cross-sector partnership. So look forward to your discussions, building an action plan for CRI, some projects, some ideas to advance the work. So excellent panel presentations from a variety of perspectives. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. And you're invited to take a seat at one of the tables when we, not right now, but in a minute, when we launch our table presentation. So I think you all know the drill. Short half-hour conversations at each of the tables. Let me ask you, do you want to organize by subtopic, agriculture, health, business, or would you rather just have the discussion more broadly? Any preferences from the group? Broadly. But stay at kind of tables as you are? Is that all right? Okay, let's do that. All right, so I believe there's a little cheat sheet for you there in terms of the questions we ask you to address. Brainstorming solutions, essentially, and then choosing some of the best ideas to advance in the context of CRI. Looking for a moderator at each of the tables to kind of loosely facilitate, a note taker as well, using the note-taking sheet for the leader. There's also note-taking sheets for each of you if you wish, because we will be collecting all of those at the end to capture all your great ideas. So you have about a half hour to do your work. Introduce yourselves if you haven't already, and go to it. Thank you so much.